The 21st of December, 1944, 6:12. A hush hung over Malmedy, Belgium, but the hush was not calm. The air ripped like broken glass across the ash-grey sky. Each exhalation turned to frost, hung for a moment, then vanished into the dawn's dim blue light. Snow lay heavy on ruined brick and twisted beams, on shattered factory windows and the shattered hopes of men. War had rendered everything familiar into jagged silence. Inside the skeletal shell of a blown-out coal processing plant, one 9-year-old Private First Class Francis S. Currey crouched beside a gaping doorway. His breath came in short hisses, his boots sat in icy slush. A borrowed bazooka lay across his frost-bitten arms. Over his back rattled the steel belt of a .30 caliber machine gun. He was exposed. Barely 30 yards ahead, the narrow road curved toward a bridge, the last open route that would lead the enemy straight into the American flank. There were no sandbags, no orders, no backup, only the decision to stand. He could have fled. The other anti-tank teams had been wiped out or forced back. He could have melted into the ruined walls of the factory and waited for darkness. But he did not. Instead, he stared at the frozen road, at the first glint of tank tracks in the mist, and made a decision. He would stay. He would fight. In the months preceding, Currey had been one of many American soldiers swept into the maw of the Western Front. Born the 29th of June 1925 in Loch Sheldrake, New York, orphaned at 12 and raised on a farm, he joined the U.S. Army as soon as he turned 18. He trained as a rifleman, shipped to Europe in 1944 with the famed 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory. He fought in France, the Netherlands and Germany, yet nothing could groom him for what was about to strike in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. On 16 December, the Germans launched their desperate counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 troops poured through the snow-laden Ardennes under cover of fog and surprise. Their objective, seize Antwerp, split the Allied lines, crush hope. The Americans holding that sector were exhausted, under-equipped, spread too thin. Communications shattered. Retreat became the unseen default. Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, reached Malmedy just as the storm broke. Their orders, hold the road network. But ahead a tank column loomed. The bridge into the road network stood like a spinal nerve of the front line. If it snapped, terms changed. The junctions of supply and survival would collapse. Now Currey sat in the ruins, the cold seeping into his bones, rust-covered beams. Snow perched on wreckage like a silent witness. Steam hissed from broken pipes. And outside, the engine growl of steel beasts crawled closer. At 6:28, the silence shattered. Treads grinding ice announced the advance. Over the ridge came a Panzer Mark V, turret scanning, frontal armor glinting. Behind it, infantry moved like shadows sliding into place. Smoke curled from burning embers. Snow churned under metal. Currey dragged the bazooka into position. No trench, no shield, only steel beams and broken concrete. He paused, heart hammering, fingertip on the cold launcher, gloves shredded, senses keyed. He aimed himself more than the weapon. At the lead tank's flank, the vulnerable lean. Then he fired. The rocket erupted. Smoke, flame, thunder. The tank jerked, stalled, fire blossomed along its side. German voices screamed. Soldiers jumped from the turret, crawling into snow-banked ruin. Currey didn't cheer. He ducked, crawled back toward the factory. Bullets kicked up slivers of brick and ice. He grabbed the Browning automatic rifle and returned fire. Then he sprinted outside to a burnt-out jeep, grabbed the mounted 50 cal machine gun, and sprayed the road. For 20 minutes he became the eye of the storm. He hauled shells, flicked belt feeds, kept the enemy pinned. The second Panzer rolled forward. He fired again. The third paused. The column stalled. The bridge remained unbroken. Inside the factory, 5 wounded comrades lay trapped beneath collapsed masonry. Currey fought his way back, threw open a door, pried metal beams aside, dragged them into partial cover. He whispered, "Stay with me," though his voice shook. Above them mortars shrieked, concrete showered down like hail. He stayed. Time bled into itself. Hours stacked like blocks of ice as he moved. Roof to window, ditch to vehicle, pulling grenades, scooping ammunition from the dead, firing at supply trucks, crippling flank attempts. Every time the German advance adjusted, Currey responded. He fired bazooka rockets from holes in walls. He took rifle aim at turret commanders. He crawled across frozen mud. He stared tanks in the eye. Once he froze mid-movement to witness a German soldier 15 feet away, equally exhausted, equally human, and neither raised a weapon. They stared. Then they turned and ran opposite ways. For a moment, the war paused. At about 9:15, the final push came. 3 tanks in staggered formation, infantry flanking in icy fields, artillery support rising. Currey had only his Garand rifle left, 3 magazines. He climbed to a second-floor window and fired at the open turret of a tank. He hit the shoulder of the commander. The tank halted. At that instant, American artillery thundered in the rear. The German column faltered. The road cleared. By 9:30, the bridge stood. The wounded men stirred. The storm quieted. When the patrol arrived, they found him slumped against the doorframe, face streaked with dried blood, helmet gone, boots crusted with ice and gore. The officer asked, "Who's in charge here?" He answered simply, "I don't know. I was trying to keep them alive." Behind him lay the wreckage of tanks, shell casings glimmering like specks of truth. Ahead lay a road still open. The men he rescued would live. Their names remained unknown, but the road held. The line held. In that frozen morning, Francis Currey didn't seek glory. He responded. He stayed. He held a single choke point with broken weapons, battered body, and a belief that someone must hold until help arrived. He found the angle no one else chose. He stood in the gap. The black and white of that morning recorded no color of medals. It recorded only survival, only choice, only duty. When the war ended, Currey received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Malmedy, an acknowledgement of what the raw footage of history could not capture alone. The man who held the line. But the true medal remains unseen. It resides in the flicker of decision. When you stand though the odds say flee. When you hold the line though the world says break. When you choose to stay. This is how Chapter 1 closes. The breach unbroken, the dawn arriving, the breath still hanging in the cold. The question left for us, what would you do when the road lies open before you and only you stand between the enemy and those behind you? The first tank died hard. Its armor cracked open like bone under fire, flames licking out from the wound. Snow hissed as it touched steel. Smoke crawled across the frozen bridge and mingled with dawn light. The sound, a grinding, metallic scream, echoed through the valley of Malmedy. Francis Currey didn't watch it burn. He moved, fast. He ducked back inside the factory, dragging the bazooka tube over splintered concrete, boots slipping on frozen mud. The weapon clanged against debris. Every sound felt too loud. The air tasted of iron and cordite. His breath came in short, white bursts. The Germans were regrouping. He could hear them orders, barked in clipped voices, boots crunching on the road, machine guns setting up to return fire. Currey dropped to a knee beside a shattered window and jammed a fresh magazine into his Browning automatic rifle. The stock was slick with frost. His hands shook, but he kept firing short, controlled bursts, cutting through the silhouettes moving in the smoke. Bullets struck the brick near his head, chipping away the edge of the window frame. He pressed lower, counting shots, feeding steel and fire into the cold morning. At 6:41, German infantry swept the street. They moved like a machine, disciplined, fearless, fueled by the momentum of the offensive that had shocked the Western Front only 5 days earlier. Behind them, another panzer rolled forward, its turrets scanning the ruins. The Ardennes offensive had been built on speed, crushed through before the Allies could reform. The German command believed the Americans near Malmedy were finished. But they hadn't accounted for one 19-year-old with a faulty launcher. Currey ducked back behind a collapsed wall. He was out of rockets. He needed more. The nearest fallen comrade lay only 20 yards away out in the open. He stared at the snow, at the empty space between, at the faint trace of smoke from that man's pack. He ran. Bullets tore the air. Shards of ice exploded around his boots. He fell, rolled, crawled the last few feet, tore open the soldier's satchel, and found it. One rocket, one chance. Dragging himself back through the mud, he jammed the round into the bazooka, braced it against a broken beam. The second Panzer was moving slower now, cautious, its cannon tracking the factory. Currey exhaled, wiped frost from the sight, and waited for the angle. Inside his head, time flattened. He didn't hear the gunfire, only his own pulse. The tank turned slightly, revealing its flank a narrow plate of thinner armor. He aimed, pulled the trigger. The rocket screamed forward, trailing smoke like a comet through snow. It hit. A flash. A shockwave. Steel split. The second tank stopped dead, turret sagging, black fire pouring out. The blast knocked Currey backward. Heat washed over his face. He rolled, coughing, ears ringing. When he looked again, the German column had stopped. Infantry scattered for cover. A third Panzer reversed down the road. The factory stood alone in the middle of chaos, a broken shell holding 6 living souls. Currey sprinted back inside. One of the wounded men was awake now, delirious, asking, "Are they gone?" Currey didn't answer. He lifted a beam, freed another soldier pinned beneath rubble. Dust filled the air, coating everything grey. He gave them water from his canteen, pressed gloved hands against bleeding wounds, whispered, "Hang on." Above them the roof trembled under artillery impact. Concrete fell like rain. Outside, the tanks repositioned. At 7:10, a new sound rose, the deeper, heavier grind of another Panzer's treads, circling toward the north flank. The Germans were adjusting tactics. They'd seen the fire from the bazooka. They knew it came from the factory. Now they meant to flank it and crush it flat. Currey had no more rockets, no grenades, no reinforcements. He looked through a hole in the wall and saw it. An American half-track burned near the bridge, half buried in snow. On its roof, the shadow of a Browning .50 caliber machine gun, still mounted, still possible. It was suicide to reach it open ground, no cover, direct line of fire. But that gun could stop the infantry and maybe even cripple another tank. He didn't think long. He slung his rifle, checked the sky, whispered to the men behind him, "Stay low," and stepped into the open. The cold hit like a hammer. He ran, boots cracking through the crust of snow. Bullets chased him whistling past, tearing holes in air and ground. Mortar blasts lifted earth in violent fountains. The half-track loomed ahead, twisted steel glowing with heat, edges sharp as razors. He dove behind it, chest heaving, lungs burning. The smell was gasoline and ash, and something worse. He climbed, fingers slipping on metal, and hauled himself up. The moment his helmet cleared the edge, a dozen rifles opened up. Sparks erupted off the hull. He ducked, yanked the bolt of the Browning, prayed it wasn't jammed. It wasn't. He fired. The 50 calories roared to life, its recoil slamming through his shoulders. Tracer rounds cut red streaks through white fog. The gun sang a brutal rhythm. Thump, 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 each beat driving the enemy back. German soldiers dropped. A half-track exploded. A third Panzer slammed its brakes, veered sideways. Currey kept firing until the barrel smoked, until the belt ran dry, until he couldn't tell the difference between the thunder of his weapon and the thunder of his heartbeat. He wasn't a man now. He was a line of defiance carved into ice. At 7:40, the gun overheated. Steam hissed from the barrel. He kicked the release lever, dropped off the half-track, and hit the ground hard. Snow bit his face. He crawled into a drainage ditch, reloading his Garand. The Germans were shouting again, trying to regroup. He heard the faint rumble of another tank repositioning through the woods. Currey's leg throbbed. A bullet had grazed him earlier. He pressed snow against it and breathed through the pain. He had no plan left, only instinct. He crawled between ruined walls, firing short bursts, scavenging ammo from corpses. He found a grenade on a dead sergeant, pulled the pin with his teeth, lobbed it toward a cluster of advancing infantry. The blast folded them into the earth. He moved again, a ghost inside the ruins. By 8:15, the battlefield had dissolved into fragments, drifting smoke, scattered snow, flickering firelight. Currey was everywhere on the second floor, firing through holes in the wall, then back at ground level pulling another man to cover, then sprinting to a window to shoot the driver of a supply truck. He became myth in motion, unseen yet felt. The Germans couldn't read his numbers. Their scouts reported heavy resistance, multiple anti-tank units, snipers in position. In truth, there was only one. He found another rocket, just one inside a wrecked jeep near the southern corner. He dragged it through mud, loaded it into the same bazooka, climbed to a window, and waited. At 8:43, another Panzer crawled into view, its gun sweeping left to right. Currey tracked it with the launcher, waiting for the turn, the angle, the chance. When it came, he fired. The rocket hit clean, cutting through armor, exploding in a bloom of smoke and fire. The crew bailed, some burning, some crawling. Currey shot the officer in the leg, stopping him cold. Then the field went quiet again. For a heartbeat, he thought it was over. Then the earth shook another barrage, closer this time. Mortars landed near the bridge. The concussion threw him down, ears ringing. He lay still, staring up at the white sky, the snow falling in lazy circles. He wasn't supposed to be alive, none of them were. But the line still held. The bridge still stood. Inside the factory, the wounded men coughed, called for water. He went back to them, one step at a time, boots dragging through ash. He knelt, poured the last of his canteen into a man's mouth, and said softly, "We're still here." Outside, the Germans hesitated. They had no idea what monster they were facing. They couldn't break the angle. At 9, their commander called for retreat to regroup. For now, the road was safe. Currey leaned against the wall, eyes half closed. His hands were burned from the hot metal of the Browning. His uniform was torn, streaked with soot. He could barely hear anything but the wind. He thought of the men behind him, still breathing. He thought of the thousands of Americans down the line who would never know his name, but who would live because a single bridge didn't fall. He stared out through the shattered doorway toward the grey horizon where smoke and snow met. The battlefield looked frozen in time bodies, metal, silence. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply endured. At 9:15, the German artillery fell silent. Somewhere beyond the hills, Allied guns had started firing back. Reinforcements were on the move. The tide had turned. Currey stayed by the door, rifle across his lap. His breath fogged in front of him, rising like incense over ruin. He had held the line for 3 hours. 3 hours of hell, carved into the white morning of Belgium. But history wasn't finished. This was only the hinge, the moment between collapse and resistance. What came next would decide not just survival, but meaning. By 9:17, the smoke from the wrecked Panzers hung like storm clouds, trapped too low to leave. The snow was blackened, the ground scarred. Inside the ruins of the coal factory, Francis Currey's world had shrunk to the distance his lungs could pull air. Every breath hurt. Every sound carried. He had been fighting for 3 hours. 3. The battle outside had slowed, but it had not stopped. The enemy was wounded, not gone. Somewhere behind the grey haze, German officers barked commands, regrouping. Somewhere deeper in the trees, artillery crews reloaded. Currey could feel the next attack coming the way an animal feels thunder. The air itself seemed to tighten. He rechecked the Browning rifle in his hands. The barrel was warm, almost comforting. The edges of his gloves were burned away, skin raw, where the fabric had fused with steel. He tasted ash and blood. His helmet was gone. The frost in his hair sparkled like iron filings. 5 wounded Americans lay behind him. They were quiet now, too quiet. One man clutched a rosary. Another hummed under his breath, a song Currey couldn't place. Their faces were pale, their eyes sunken. They trusted him without words, as if this 19-year-old somehow knew what came next. He didn't. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried the rattle of chains, the scrape of treads. The 4th Panzer was moving. Currey peered through the hole in the wall. The tank approached from the north side this time, flanking the factory, the smart move. Its gun barrel cut a black line through the mist. Infantry followed, crouched low, advancing in the snow. The Americans had no heavy weapons left. No bazooka rounds, no grenades, no artillery support. Just Currey and what he could carry. He looked at the men behind him and understood something sharp and simple. If he stayed here, they might live. If he ran, they wouldn't. He crawled toward the doorway, his knees sinking into soot and ice. The world outside was a smear of smoke and snow. Every shadow looked like an enemy. Every breath turned to glass. He rose to a crouch and started moving, dragging the rifle across his chest, slipping between ruins. His body felt like borrowed machinery, pain dulled by purpose, fear replaced by habit. The Panzer's cannon fired. The blast tore a hole through the southern wall, shaking the ground. The concussion threw Currey forward, face first into rubble. His ears rang. The world went white, then black, then grey again. He pushed up, spitting dust. Another round exploded nearby, showering him with debris. He crawled into a side room and pressed his back to the wall, his heart hammered like artillery. Through the cracks, he could see movement, German infantry sweeping closer, fanning out along the bridge. He knew what had to happen. The bridge could not fall. That was the line between chaos and collapse. He climbed to the 2nd floor, boots crunching on broken glass. From here he could see almost everything: the bridge, the road, the tank advancing slowly, the infantry shifting positions like pieces on a chessboard. He raised his rifle, exhaled, and began to fire. Each shot cracked like ice breaking. Each recoil echoed through his shoulders. He dropped one man, then another. The Germans scattered for cover, firing back blindly at the upper windows. Bullets punched through plaster, shredding the air around him. He ducked low, reloaded, fired again. He wasn't shooting for glory. He was buying seconds small, precious seconds for the wounded below, for the reinforcements that might come, for the line that had to hold. At 9:38, mortar rounds started falling again. They came in slow arcs, hissing through the clouds before striking with violent precision. One hit the far corner of the factory, collapsing the roof in a rain of dust and fire. The upper floor groaned, ready to fall. Currey dropped his rifle and slid down the debris slope, landing hard. His shoulder cracked against concrete. He gasped, staggered to his feet, and ran for the main hall. Inside, the air was thick with smoke. The wounded men coughed, choking. He tore a piece of his sleeve and wrapped it around his mouth. He could barely see, but he could hear the tank outside, its engine revving, its gears grinding closer. He reached the doorway and saw the barrel of the Panzer turning toward him. He dove sideways just as the cannon fired. The blast shattered the wall where he had been standing. The factory groaned. The world tilted. He rolled onto his stomach, covered in dust and splinters. The air was a storm of sound, gunfire, collapsing brick, the roar of engines. He had no more weapons left but his rifle. He checked the magazine. 8 rounds. He smiled bitterly. 8 chances, he muttered. He stepped into the open. The snow hit his face, cold and clean. The Panzer loomed less than 50 yards away, its machine guns spitting fire. He fired back 1, 2, 3, striking the gunner, forcing the turret to retract. He kept moving, zigzagging toward the half-track wreck he had used earlier. Smoke coiled from its belly. The 50 calories still sat, mounted, scorched but intact. He reached it, slammed the bolt, and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared again, its voice deep and ancient. The recoil slammed through his spine. He swept left to right, cutting down infantry, trying to cross the bridge. Sparks danced off the tank's armor as his bullets struck. The enemy formation broke. Men dove into ditches, shouting in German, panic replacing discipline. For 20 minutes he held that gun, a single silhouette against the snowstorm. The ground around him was littered with shell casings, glowing faint red in the cold. His face was blackened with soot. His eyes glinted through the smoke. When the belt ran out, he kicked free the casing and dropped from the wreck. He crawled into the nearest ditch, body shaking from exhaustion. He pressed his forehead into the snow and breathed, the cold burning his lungs. The enemy began to pull back. He could hear it, the slow, deliberate retreat of treads reversing. German voices fading. A whistle blown twice, signaling withdrawal. The assault had failed. He didn't celebrate. He just listened. The sound of retreat was quieter than victory, but it meant life. At 9:52, the first American artillery shells landed beyond the bridge. Their own reinforcements were finally firing from the rear, pounding the German line. Currey stayed low, covering his head as explosions rolled across the horizon. When the shelling stopped, he stood. The bridge was still standing. The factory was still there, though half its roof had caved. He limped back toward it. His rifle hung from its strap, barrel smoking faintly. His leg bled through a tear in the fabric. He hardly noticed. Inside, he found the 5 men alive, bloodied, coughing, but alive. He dropped beside them, tore open a first-aid packet, wrapped a bandage, poured water from a dented canteen. One soldier whispered, "You still here, kid?" Currey nodded once. "Still here." Outside, the snow fell again, soft as silence. The battlefield was a painting now, black smoke drifting into white sky, broken tanks frozen mid-burn, shell craters filling with ice. He sat against a beam, head back, eyes closed. His fingers trembled from the weight of the rifle, from everything. He didn't think about medals. He didn't think about history. He thought about the small warmth of the canteen in his hands and the sound of breathing behind him. That was enough. He had held the bridge. He had stopped the panzers. He had saved his men. And yet he knew it wasn't over. Not really. The front was still shifting. The Germans would come again somewhere else. The war would grind on. But for this morning, 3 hours of hell frozen in Belgium, one man had made the difference. The radio crackled faintly, a voice breaking through static. "Company K, do you copy? Reinforcements inbound." Currey looked toward the horizon, where the smoke was beginning to lift, revealing faint streaks of light breaking through the clouds. He didn't answer right away. He just watched. The light looked unreal, fragile, like something that didn't belong to war. That light, thin, trembling, unstoppable, was the only color left in a black and white world. By 9:30 that morning, the gunfire had fallen silent, but silence in war was never trustful. It sat heavy, full of ghosts and unfinished echoes. The smoke over Malmedy drifted like torn fabric, grey against a sky that had forgotten color. Somewhere in the trees, engines idled waiting. Somewhere beyond the river, artillery coughed. And inside the shattered coal factory, Francis Sherman Currey listened for death and heard only the wind. He was 20 yards from collapse, blood dried on his neck, frost stitched to his uniform. His body trembled, not from fear but from what comes after it, exhaustion deep enough to feel like gravity. For 3 hours he had fought alone, fed by belief and adrenaline, and now that belief was flickering, running on fumes. He stepped outside the ruins. The bridge was still there. The road that had once belonged to the enemy now lay littered with wreckage steel carcasses of 3 panzers, their black smoke rolling low and slow across the snow. The half-track he had manned earlier hissed as its metal cooled. Everywhere he looked, the world was scarred, but it was still theirs. From above, it might have looked like a still photograph, one man standing amid the aftermath of a battle no one believed could be won. But to the men crawling out from basements, from foxholes, from wrecks, that one man meant something larger than survival. Currey dragged himself toward the bridge. Each step felt like a test. His boots crunched through layers of ice and ash. A German rifle lay half buried in snow. He kicked it aside, scanning for movement. Nothing. Just wind whispering across the valley. He reached the midpoint of the bridge and leaned against the rail. Below, the river ran dark and slow, choked with ice and the reflection of smoke. He had expected fear, maybe even guilt, but what came instead was an odd stillness, the kind that comes after you've done everything you can, and the world hasn't yet decided if it was enough. Behind him, the factory groaned under its own ruins. He turned back, limping, dragging dust with each step. Inside, the 5 wounded soldiers he had rescued were still breathing. He knelt beside them, checked pulses, tightened bandages. One of them stirred. "Did we make it?" the man whispered. Currey nodded. "You're still here, aren't you?" The soldier tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. Currey smiled faintly. "That counts." Out on the ridge, American artillery thundered. The long-awaited counterstrike had begun. 105mm shells tearing into the forest where the German column had regrouped. Reports would later confirm that the delay Currey had bought, those 3 impossible hours, allowed the U.S. 30th Infantry Division to reposition its lines and plug the breach before the Panzers could push through. His stand had fractured the tempo of the German offensive, a small stall that changed the rhythm of the battle itself. But Currey didn't know that. Not yet. He wasn't thinking about strategy or maps. He was thinking about the weight of the rifle in his hands and how the metal felt warmer than his skin. He moved to the doorway, scanning the tree line. The artillery kept firing, closer now. Smoke rose in columns. For the first time since dawn, he realized what the sound meant. They were winning. At 10:04, the first American patrol reached the sector. A squad from Company K, mud-covered, shivering, eyes wide with disbelief, approached the bridge expecting to find a massacre. Instead, they found Currey, standing alone beside the ruins, rifle slung low, face blackened with soot. "Where's the rest of your team?" the sergeant called out. Currey turned, his voice quiet but steady. "There is no team." The men exchanged looks, half awe, half confusion. One of them whispered, "You did this?" Currey didn't answer. He pointed toward the wounded. "Help me get them out." They did. Together they hauled the injured through snow and debris, carried them across the bridge. Currey moved slower now, his body failing him one limb at a time. When it was done, he leaned against a wall, breathing hard. The sergeant approached. "You realize you held off 3 tanks and God knows how many infantry?" Currey shook his head. "I just didn't want them crossing." That line would later appear in his Medal of Honor citation, stripped of all drama, preserved in official ink. He prevented the enemy from crossing the bridge and held his position despite intense fire. But here, in the grey ruins of Belgium, there were no medals, only silence and the sound of snow hitting the hot steel of the destroyed panzers. When reinforcements secured the area, medics urged him to rest. He refused. He spent the next hour helping evacuate the wounded, marking German positions for artillery correction. His hands shook too much to reload, but he could still point, still speak, still move. By noon, the snow had started again. Small flakes, soft as ash, drifting through the smoke. The light caught them like static. Currey watched them fall. He thought about how quiet the world was when no one was shooting. He thought about his mother's porch back in New York, how the wind used to hum through the trees at dusk. He thought about how much the snow here looked like home, except for the smell. The smell was what made it real. Burned oil, frozen blood, and something chemical that clung to the back of his throat. He turned away from it, walking toward the field where the tanks burned. The Germans had left their dead in neat, disciplined lines, as if even in defeat, order mattered. He knelt beside one of the bodies, a boy not much older than himself, his uniform stiff with frost. Currey stared for a moment, then closed the soldier's eyes. For all the rage and thunder of war, its end was always quiet. Later that day, when command officers arrived, the scene spoke for itself. 3 disabled tanks, dozens of enemy dead. 5 Americans alive in a position that should have been obliterated. Every calculation said it was impossible. One colonel asked him, "How'd you manage to hold this place alone?" Currey shrugged. Didn't seem right to leave. That answer would become the essence of his legend. Plain, unpolished, stubbornly human. By dusk, reinforcements had fully secured the area. The artillery batteries that Currey's defense had bought time for were now dug in and firing into the northern woods, pounding the remnants of the German column back across the ridge. The Battle of the Bulge, once Hitler's desperate thrust westward, had begun to slow. Currey sat beside the bridge again. The snow had covered much of the wreckage now, muting the scene into grayscale serenity. The light was fading, the day collapsing into the long shadow of winter. He could feel the ache in his hands, the burns, the cuts, the blisters where the machine gun's barrel had seared through his gloves. He flexed his fingers. Pain meant alive. Alive meant something. He leaned back, watching the horizon. Somewhere far off, church bells rang faintly through the smoke. He thought about faith not in religion, but in the invisible line between men that keeps one standing when the rest fall. That line had held today. When night came, Currey lay on a cot in a temporary aid station. His uniform was still damp. His dog tags rested cold against his chest. A medic offered him morphine. He refused. He just wanted silence. Outside the tent, trucks rolled by, headlights off, engines muffled in snow. The war continued beyond his field of sight. But something fundamental had shifted. The German push that had threatened to split the Allied line was now fractured. At headquarters that night, an operations officer circled the map near Malmedy and wrote 2 words: bridge held. It was enough. Back in the aid station, Currey finally slept. Not the restless half-sleep of battle, but the deep, heavy kind that comes when a man has spent everything he has. His hands twitched as he dreamed of running, of smoke, of snow that never melted. The war would not end for months. The medals would not come for half a year. But the tide had turned, and the 19-year-old who had refused to run had already done more than most armies could. The snow did not stop that night. It fell quietly, like the war was trying to cover its own tracks. By dawn, the battlefield outside Malmedy looked reborn white again, almost clean, as if the horror had been erased. But beneath that snow were tanks, rifles, helmets, and men. Beneath that snow was memory, refusing to die. Francis Sherman Currey lay in a field cot inside a makeshift medical tent. The air smelled of iodine and smoke. Outside, stretchers passed by in the half-light, boots crunching snow in rhythm to distant artillery. The war still breathed somewhere beyond the ridgeline, but here, in this temporary stillness, the sound had changed. It wasn't the chaos of battle now, it was the steady pulse of endurance. Currey opened his eyes. His hands were bandaged, his skin raw and blistered. He flexed his fingers slowly. Pain bit back, alive and real. A medic leaned over him. "You should rest, soldier." Currey shook his head. "Not yet." He sat up, ignoring the sting in his leg. Through the flap of the tent, he could see the bridge, the same bridge he had refused to abandon. A column of American armor was crossing it now, engines growling low, tracks grinding the ice that had once threatened to consume them all. He watched the tanks roll over his battlefield, over the frozen remains of what had been yesterday's fight. The scene felt both intimate and distant, like he was watching someone else's war. He had no words for it. He just breathed, slow and steady, as if drawing air from history itself. By mid-afternoon, command officers arrived. They came in jeeps, their coats pressed, their boots clean, men of rank and responsibility. The battle was already being reduced to coordinates and maps, its chaos flattened into reports and diagrams. They questioned him for hours. Where did the tanks come from? How many Germans did you engage? Were you aware you were isolated? Currey answered each one the same way, plain, factual, without flourish. He spoke of destroyed tanks, of wounded men, of firing until the barrel melted. When an officer asked, "Why didn't you fall back?" he looked up, eyes clear. There was nowhere to fall back to. They wrote it down. Every word. None of them captured the weight of it. Later, as the afternoon sun cut through the mist, a photographer arrived, a combat correspondent from Stars and Stripes. He wanted a picture of the hero of Malmedy. Currey refused at first, but the man insisted, saying, "People back home need to see what courage looks like." So he stood by the bridge, rifle slung low, snow drifting past his shoulders. The photographer adjusted the lens, framed the shot, and clicked. The shutter snapped once, and in that instant, Francis Currey became part of history. A frozen moment, black and white, quiet and eternal. That photograph would later appear in newspapers across America. A 19-year-old private who held the line against German tanks. The caption would read, "He stayed when no one else could." But at that moment, Currey didn't feel like a symbol. He just felt tired. In the following days, Malmedy began to rebuild. The 30th Infantry Division reformed its ranks, pushing north towards Stavelot and Trois-Ponts. The Battle of the Bulge raged on, and every inch of frozen ground was paid for with blood. The war's grand machinery moved forward headlines, strategies, victories. But amid that scale, men like Currey disappeared into the grey fabric of survival. He never asked for promotion, though it came. He never boasted, though others tried to tell his story. He simply returned to the duty at hand, guarding supply lines, escorting convoys, standing sentry in the endless cold. War does not end when the guns fall silent. It ends in the long, invisible work that comes after. And Currey, more than anyone, understood that. In July 1945, the war was nearly over when the letter came. It bore the seal of the United States War Department. The envelope trembled in his hands as he opened it. Inside was the official notice. He was to receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest recognition for valor. The words were crisp, formal, impersonal. His conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Currey read them once, then folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He didn't tell anyone that night. When the ceremony came, he stood before President Harry S. Truman, his uniform freshly pressed, the medal's blue ribbon placed around his neck. Flashbulbs burst. The crowd applauded. Truman smiled and said, "You must be proud." Currey replied, "Sir, I'm just grateful we made it out." That was it. No speech, no bravado. Just the same simplicity that had carried him through the ruins of Belgium. After the war, he went home to New York. The hills were green again, not grey. The air no longer smelled of cordite, but of pine and rain. He worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs in Albany, helping other soldiers navigate the maze of paperwork, benefits, and recovery. He didn't speak of Belgium often. When people asked, he would shrug and say, "Just did what had to be done." His Medal of Honor stayed in a drawer, next to an old photograph and a folded map of Europe. He lived quietly, modestly, faithfully. He married, raised a family, grew old without ceremony. But for those who knew him, neighbors, co-workers, veterans, there was something about his silence that spoke louder than stories ever could. He carried the war not as a wound, but as a lesson, that courage is not noise, it's endurance. The decades passed. The world changed, built monuments, forgot names, replaced wars with new ones. But the bridge at Malmedy still stood. The factory was gone, only a concrete foundation remained, overgrown with grass. Tourists and historians came sometimes, tracing the map, searching for the spot where a single man had held a line that should have broken. They said the air there felt different, colder, heavier, as if the snow still remembered. In 2009, long after most had stopped telling the story, the post office in Hurleyville, New York, was renamed the Francis S. Currey Post Office. Local children came with flags. Veterans stood in silence, hands over hearts. A bronze plaque was unveiled. It read simply, "He held the bridge at Malmedy. He never let it fall." Currey was there that day, older now, hair white, voice soft but sure. He didn't give a speech. He just smiled, nodded at the crowd and said, "It wasn't about me. It was about the men behind me." The audience stood still. No one moved. No one spoke. Because somehow everyone knew that's what true heroism sounded like. He lived to 94. When he passed away in 2019, newspapers wrote his name again. Francis Sherman Currey, Medal of Honor recipient, dies at 94. The headlines were brief. The world had moved on. But among the men of the 30th Infantry Division, those who remembered that frozen bridge, his name never faded. What makes his story endure is not the fire, not the tanks, not even the medal. It's the choice. The choice to stay when logic said run. The choice to fight when every instinct screamed surrender. The choice to risk everything not for country, not for glory, but for the men behind him. In the language of history, that choice is called valor. But in the language of humanity, it's something simpler: responsibility. He wasn't fearless. He was faithful. He wasn't loud. He was steady. He didn't seek legend. He created legacy. Standing on that bridge, surrounded by snow and ruin, Currey had embodied something the world rarely names, but always recognizes: the moment when an ordinary person does the impossible because someone has to. And that is why his story still matters. Because it reminds us that greatness doesn't always arrive with banners or fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a 19-year-old with frostbitten hands and a borrowed weapon, staring down tanks at dawn. Sometimes it's the silence after courage that echoes the longest. The historians call it a tactical delay. The military reports call it a defensive action. But the truth is simpler. It was a stand, one man's refusal to move. And in that refusal lies a truth worth remembering. That history is not shaped only by generals or nations, but by moments of human will. Moments when someone looks at the impossible and says, "I will not yield." Francis Sherman Currey did not yield. Not in Belgium, not in life.